I'm Elena, 29, and I thought my biggest problem was surviving another family gathering where my sister treated me like her personal punching bag. But when she decided to publicly humiliate me in front of her fiancé's entire family, calling me a pathetic courthouse clerk who'll never amount to anything, I watched her perfect world crumble in real time. Because what my sister didn't know, what nobody in my family knew, was that the courthouse clerk she was mocking was actually Judge Elena Rodriguez, the youngest federal judge appointed in our district's history. Before we dive into this story of epic family karma, I'm curious, have you ever been underestimated by someone who should know you better? What do you think happened when her fiancé realized exactly who I was? Drop your predictions in the comments, smash that like button if you love stories where secrets explode at the worst possible moment, and don't forget to subscribe because this identity reveal will leave you speechless. Trust me, you need to see how this family drama unfolds. Growing up, the family hierarchy was crystal clear. Rebecca was the star, and I was the supporting cast member who existed to make her shine brighter. For years older than me, Rebecca had mastered the art of being the perfect daughter, homecoming queen, valedictorian, full scholarship to Stanford for pre-law. Meanwhile, I was the quiet, bookish younger sister who preferred reading legal briefs to dating and chose community college over the party scene. Our parents never bothered hiding their favoritism. Every family dinner became a Rebecca appreciation ceremony. Did you hear Rebecca made partner at Morrison & Associates? Mom would gush. The youngest partner in the firm's history. Dad would beam with pride, adding, following in her old man's footsteps. Law runs in this family. They'd glance at me with barely concealed disappointment. Elena's doing fine too, Mom would say with forced enthusiasm. Still working at the courthouse. The way she said courthouse made it sound like I was emptying trash cans instead of serving justice. What they didn't understand, what I'd never told them, was that my community college path had been deliberately strategic. I'd earned my associate's degree while simultaneously completing my bachelor's through an accelerated program, then blazed through law school at Georgetown on a full academic scholarship while working as a clerk to gain real courtroom experience. By 25, I was a practicing attorney. By 27, I was being considered for a federal judgeship. By 28, I was confirmed as Judge Elena Rodriguez, presiding over one of the busiest federal courts in the Pacific Northwest. But to my family, I was still just Elena, the disappointment who worked at the courthouse. The secrecy hadn't been intentional at first. When I'd tried to share my law school acceptance with the family, Rebecca had literally laughed. Elena, be realistic. Do you know how competitive law school is? Maybe you should focus on finding a nice paralegal program instead. Mom and Dad had nodded in agreement, suggesting I'd be practical about my limitations. After that humiliation, I'd stopped sharing my achievements. When I graduated law school magna cum laude, I celebrated alone. When I passed the bar exam, I kept it to myself. When I was sworn in as a federal judge, I told them I'd gotten a promotion at work and left it at that. Part of me enjoyed the secret. There was something deeply satisfying about watching Rebecca pontificate about legal matters at family gatherings, getting basic concepts wrong while I sat quietly, knowing I had more legal authority in my pinky finger than she'd ever achieve in her career as a divorce attorney. But the larger part of me was hurt. I'd achieved something extraordinary. Becoming a federal judge before 30 was almost unheard of. Yet my own family couldn't be bothered to ask about my life in enough detail to discover it. Rebecca's engagement to David Martinez had brought out the worst of the family dynamics. David was a successful corporate attorney, handsome, charming, and from a wealthy family. Their engagement party had been a social event worthy of a magazine spread, and Rebecca had spent months planning an equally elaborate wedding. But more than that, Rebecca had made it clear that David represented her ultimate victory over me. Finally, she'd announced at the engagement party, "I'm marrying someone who understands the law like I do." David appreciates intelligence and ambition in a woman. The implied contrast was obvious, unlike Elena, who would never attract someone sophisticated enough to appreciate legal brilliance. What made it even more galling was that David actually seemed like a decent person. The few times we'd interacted, he'd been kind and genuinely interested in my thoughts on various topics. He'd asked thoughtful questions about my work, though I'd been vague in my responses, maintaining the fiction that I was just a courthouse employee. But Rebecca couldn't stand even minimal positive attention directed toward me. If David asked about my day, she'd quickly redirect the conversation to her latest case. If he complimented something I'd said, she'd make a joke about my simple courthouse perspective on complex legal matters. The pattern had been building for months, but it reached a crescendo during the wedding planning process. Rebecca had appointed herself the expert on all things legal and professional, frequently making pronouncements about courtroom procedures that were laughably wrong. I'd learned to bite my tongue and let her maintain her delusions of expertise. The breaking point came during the rehearsal dinner preparation. Rebecca had insisted that I help with the setup despite my protests that I had work obligations. "Elena, your little courthouse job can spare you for one afternoon," she'd said dismissively. "Family comes first, and this is the most important day of my life." I'd rearranged my court schedule, something that required significant coordination with other federal judges, to accommodate her demands. But when I arrived at the venue, Rebecca immediately assigned me to menial tasks while positioning herself as the sophisticated coordinator managing important details. "Elena, can you handle the chair arrangements?" she directed, while she managed the complex vendor negotiations. Never mind that I negotiated million-dollar legal settlements in my day job while she handled divorce proceedings and custody disputes. But I'd bitten my tongue, arranged chairs, and told myself it was just one day. I could endure Rebecca's condescension for one day to avoid family drama. What I hadn't anticipated was that Rebecca wasn't content with private humiliation. She was planning to make her superiority over me the entertainment for David's family. The rehearsal dinner was held at an upscale restaurant that Rebecca had chosen specifically to impress David's family. His parents were both retired professionals, his father a former federal prosecutor, his mother a retired appellate court judge. His sister was a constitutional law professor at a prestigious university. These were people who understood the legal world at the highest levels. As we gathered for pre-dinner cocktails, I found myself genuinely enjoying conversations with David's family. His father, Miguel, had some fascinating stories about high-profile federal cases he'd prosecuted. His mother, Carmen, shared insights about appellate procedure that showed real depth of understanding. His sister, Dr. Patricia Martinez, was brilliant and engaging, discussing recent Supreme Court decisions with nuanced analysis. For the first time in years, I was in my element, surrounded by people who spoke my professional language. I found myself relaxing, engaging more naturally in the conversation, even offering some insights of my own based on my courtroom experience. That's when Rebecca noticed that I was having actual conversations with her future in-laws instead of quietly fading into the background as expected. I could see the panic in her eyes as she realized that David's family was treating me as an intellectual equal rather than dismissing me as the family disappointment. And that's when she decided to publicly put me back in my place. "Oh, Elena," Rebecca announced loudly, interrupting a conversation I was having with Carmen about recent changes in federal sentencing guidelines. "You'll have to forgive my sister. She gets a little carried away sometimes, trying to sound like she understands legal matters." The table went quiet. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment, but Rebecca wasn't finished. "Elena works as a clerk at the local courthouse," she continued with a patronizing smile. "She files papers and schedules appointments. Sweet of her to try to keep up with real legal conversations, but you know how it is, a little knowledge can be dangerous." The silence that followed was deafening. David's family looked uncomfortable, unsure how to respond to such blatant cruelty. I sat frozen, 29 years of accommodation and conflict avoidance keeping me silent even in the face of such humiliation. But Rebecca, emboldened by what she perceived as victory, decided to twist the knife deeper. "Elena's always been the dreamer in the family," she said with false fondness. "Remember when you thought you were going to be a lawyer?" She laughed as if this were the most amusing thing in the world. "Thank goodness you found something more suitable to your abilities." That's when David, who had been staring at me with growing recognition throughout Rebecca's performance, slowly put down his wine glass and said the words that would change everything. "Rebecca, do you realize you're talking about Judge Rodriguez?" The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate. Rebecca's confident smile faltered as she processed what David had just said, her brain clearly struggling to make sense of the disconnect between her narrative and his words. "I'm sorry, what?" she said, her voice taking on that sharp edge it always got when someone challenged her version of reality. David turned to look at me directly, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Elena Rodriguez. You're Judge Elena Rodriguez from the Federal District Court. I've read your decisions on corporate liability cases. Your ruling on the Morrison vs. Pacific Industries case was brilliant. It's being cited in law schools across the country." The color drained from Rebecca's face so quickly I thought she might faint. Around the table, David's family was having their own moment of recognition. Miguel, his father, dropped his fork with a clatter that echoed through the suddenly silent restaurant. "Dear God," Miguel breathed, "Judge Rodriguez. I appeared before you last month on the Hernandez federal prosecution. You're the youngest federal judge in the district." Carmen, David's mother, covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with shock. "Elena, you're the Judge Rodriguez who wrote the opinion on constitutional due process that we discussed in my judicial ethics seminar? The one that's being reviewed by the Supreme Court." I sat frozen, watching my carefully maintained secret explode across the table like shrapnel. For 3 years, I'd kept my professional identity separate from my family life, and now it was all collapsing in the most public way possible. But it was Patricia, David's sister, who delivered the killing blow to Rebecca's worldview. "Judge Rodriguez," she said with something approaching reverence, "your analysis of Fourth Amendment protections in digital privacy cases is reshaping constitutional law. I've assigned your decisions as required reading in my advanced constitutional law course." Rebecca's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She looked around the table at the faces of her future in-laws, all of whom were staring at me with expressions of respect and admiration that she'd clearly expected to be reserved for her alone. That's impossible," Rebecca finally managed to stammer. "Elena works as a courthouse clerk. She files papers." She can't be." "Rebecca," David said gently, but with unmistakable shock in his voice, "how did you not know your own sister is a federal judge?" The question hit like a physical blow. How do you explain to someone that your family has been so uninterested in your life that they never bothered to ask what your actual job title was? How do you admit that you've been so condescended to for so long that you stopped trying to share your achievements? "I don't understand," Carmen said, looking between Rebecca and me with confusion. "Elena, why didn't you tell us? When Miguel mentioned appearing before Judge Rodriguez last month, why didn't you say anything?" The weight of all their eyes on me was overwhelming. I'd spent years hiding this part of my life, and now I was being forced to explain why in front of an audience that included the woman who had just publicly humiliated me for being exactly what she'd mocked me for not being. I started, then stopped, looking at Rebecca's stricken face. Even after what she'd just done to me, some part of me wanted to protect her from the full truth. But David's family deserved an honest answer. "My family has never shown much interest in the details of my work," I said carefully. "When I tried to share my law school acceptance years ago, I was told to be realistic about my limitations. After that, I stopped discussing my career progress with them." Miguel's face darkened with understanding. "You mean they didn't know you went to law school? They didn't know you passed the bar? They had no idea you were confirmed as a federal judge?" "They knew I got a promotion at work," I said quietly. I didn't elaborate beyond that. The silence that followed was devastating. David's family was clearly processing the implications of what I'd just revealed, that my own family had been so dismissive of my potential that I'd felt the need to hide one of the most prestigious achievements possible in the legal field. But Rebecca, instead of showing any shame or remorse for her behavior, doubled down on denial. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice rising with panic and anger. "Elena, stop this. You're embarrassing yourself. Federal judges are appointed by the president. They're confirmed by the Senate. You can't just pretend to be someone you're not. David pulled out his phone and within seconds was showing Rebecca a photo from a legal website. Rebecca, this is the official federal district court page. Look. Rebecca stared at the screen, her face cycling through disbelief, shock, and finally, dawning horror as she realized that everything she'd built her identity around, being the successful lawyer in the family, being the one who understood the law, being superior to her courthouse clerk sister, was a lie built on her own willful ignorance. The Honorable Elena Rodriguez, David read from the website, appointed to the federal district court at age 28, youngest federal judge in the district's history. Graduated magna cum laude from Georgetown Law School. Former clerk to Justice Morrison on the Court of Appeals. Patricia was frantically searching on her own phone. Elena, oh my God, you clerked for Justice Morrison? He's legendary. And you've only been on the bench for 8 months, but your decisions are already being studied nationwide. You're being mentioned as a potential Supreme Court candidate for the future. Each revelation was another nail in the coffin of Rebecca's superiority complex. Her entire identity had been built around being the successful lawyer who overshadowed her pathetic little sister. Now she was discovering that her pathetic little sister had achieved more in the legal field by age 29 than Rebecca might achieve in her entire career. But you live in that tiny apartment, Rebecca said desperately, grasping for any evidence that I was still the failure she'd always believed me to be. You drive an old car. You don't have any money. Federal judges are required to avoid displays of wealth that might suggest impropriety, Carmen explained gently. Elena's probably earning more than all of us combined, but she has to maintain a modest lifestyle. Miguel nodded in agreement. Judge Rodriguez, I have to ask, when I appeared before you last month, did you recognize my name? Did you know I was David's father? I nodded slowly. I did. But judicial ethics prevented me from discussing it, and besides, the family connection hadn't been disclosed to me through normal channels. The implication was clear. David's family had no idea that the judge presiding over Miguel's case was related to them because my own family hadn't bothered to share that information. David was staring at Rebecca with a mixture of disbelief and disappointment that made my heart ache for her, despite everything she'd just put me through. Rebecca, how could you not know this? How could you not know your own sister is a federal judge? Rebecca's face crumpled as the full weight of her humiliation crashed down on her. She'd just spent the evening mocking her sister's lack of legal knowledge in front of a room full of legal professionals who knew that sister to be one of the most promising young judges in the country. But instead of apologizing or showing any remorse, Rebecca did what she'd always done when confronted with evidence that didn't fit her worldview, she lashed out. This is all your fault, she screamed at me, her voice echoing through the restaurant as other diners turned to stare. You deliberately hid this from us. You let us think you were a failure just so you could embarrass me. The accusation was so backwards, so completely detached from reality, that I felt something snap inside me. For years, I'd accommodated Rebecca's need to feel superior. I'd hidden my achievements to avoid threatening her fragile ego. I'd endured condescension and dismissal to keep family peace. But watching her blame me for her own willful ignorance while sitting in front of people who actually understood the magnitude of what I'd accomplished, that was the moment I decided I was done protecting Rebecca from the consequences of her own behavior. Rebecca, I said quietly, standing up from the table, I didn't hide anything from you. I stopped sharing my life with people who made it clear they weren't interested in hearing about it. And with that, I gathered my purse and coat and walked toward the restaurant exit, leaving behind the wreckage of my family's assumptions and the devastating truth that they'd never bothered to really know me at all. I didn't go straight home after leaving the restaurant. Instead, I drove to the one place that had always brought me peace, the federal courthouse where I spent my days dispensing justice and making decisions that affected thousands of lives. The building was mostly empty at night, but my security badge granted me access to my chambers, and I needed the familiar comfort of my office to process what had just happened. Sitting behind my mahogany desk, surrounded by law books and the formal portraits of judges who had come before me, I felt the weight of the evening's revelation settling in. My phone had been buzzing nonstop during the drive, but I'd ignored it. Whatever chaos was erupting in the aftermath of that dinner, I wasn't ready to deal with it yet. But the silence of my chambers gave me space to think, and what I kept coming back to was David's expression when he'd realized who I was. Not just surprise or shock, but something that looked like hurt. The realization that his fiancée had been systematically humiliating someone he clearly respected professionally. The first call I finally answered was from Patricia, David's sister. Her voice was gentle but urgent when I picked up. "Elena, I hope you don't mind me calling. David gave me your number because we needed to apologize for what happened tonight." "You have nothing to apologize for," I said quietly. "You didn't know." "That's exactly what we need to apologize for. The way Rebecca spoke to you, the things she said, knowing now who you are and what you've accomplished, it's horrifying. But even if you weren't Judge Rodriguez, even if you really were just a courthouse clerk, the way she treated you was inexcusable." Patricia's words hit something deep in my chest. Someone finally understood that the title wasn't what mattered, the basic human dignity was. "Elena, can I ask you something?" she continued. "How long has she been treating you like this?" The question opened a floodgate of memories I'd been suppressing for years. "Always," I admitted. "Since we were kids. I was never smart enough, never accomplished enough, never good enough to be worthy of respect in Rebecca's eyes." "And your parents? They allowed this?" I laughed bitterly. "They encouraged it. Rebecca was the golden child who could do no wrong. I was the disappointment who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention I got." Patricia was quiet for a long moment. "Elena, you know this isn't normal, right? Families should celebrate each other's successes, not tear each other down. What you've accomplished, becoming a federal judge at your age, that's extraordinary. Your family should be proud of you, not ignorant of your achievements because they never bothered to ask." After ending the call with Patricia, I finally looked at my phone to see the flood of missed messages and calls. Most were from Rebecca, ranging from angry demands that I call her back to increasingly desperate attempts at damage control. But there were also messages from my parents, clearly having been filled in on the evening's revelations. Mom's voicemail was particularly revealing. "Elena, honey, why didn't you tell us you were a judge? We had no idea. You should have said something. How were we supposed to know if you never told us?" The blame shifting was so automatic, so perfectly in character, that I almost laughed. Even faced with clear evidence that they'd been dismissive and uninterested in my life, they were making it my fault for not forcing them to pay attention. Dad's message was shorter but equally telling. "Elena, your mother and I are very proud of your success. We always knew you had potential. Perhaps we could discuss this further when things calm down." Potential. As if my confirmation as a federal judge was just the beginning of what I might someday achieve, rather than the culmination of years of hard work they'd been too self-absorbed to notice. But it was the message from David that really caught my attention. His voice was strained, exhausted, and painfully honest. "Elena, I don't even know what to say about tonight. I'm so sorry about Rebecca's behavior, and I'm sorry that none of us knew who you really were. I keep thinking about all the conversations we've had, how you'd make these insightful comments about legal issues, and I just assumed you were naturally smart about these things. I had no idea you were speaking from actual judicial experience." He paused, and I could hear the weight of what he was processing. "I need you to know that what happened tonight has changed everything for me. The way Rebecca spoke to you, the casual cruelty of it, and then to discover that she's been treating someone of your stature like that. Someone who's achieved more in the legal field than I might ever achieve. I can't unsee that, Elena. I can't pretend it didn't happen." The message ended there, but the implications were clear. David was questioning everything he thought he knew about the woman he was planning to marry. Around midnight, my office phone rang. The caller ID showed it was the main courthouse number, which meant someone was calling from the security desk downstairs. "Judge Rodriguez, I'm sorry to bother you so late, but there's a woman here demanding to see you." She says she's your sister? Rebecca Rodriguez? I closed my eyes, knowing this confrontation was inevitable. Send her up. 5 minutes later, Rebecca burst into my chambers like a hurricane of anger and desperation. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup streaked with tears, and her designer dress wrinkled from what had clearly been hours of panic and frustration. Elena, what the hell do you think you're doing? She demanded, not even bothering with pretense of civility. I'm sitting in my office, I replied calmly, processing the events of the evening. Don't you dare act innocent with me. You deliberately sabotaged my rehearsal dinner. You humiliated me in front of David's family. The accusation was so backwards it took my breath away. Rebecca, I didn't say a word about my profession tonight. You were the one who chose to publicly mock my career and intelligence. The fact that you were wrong about what my career actually is, that's entirely on you. You should have told me, she screamed. You should have told all of us. How was I supposed to know you were some big important judge if you never said anything? I tried to tell you about law school, I reminded her. You laughed at me and told me to be realistic about my limitations. After that, I stopped sharing my achievements with people who made it clear they weren't interested in celebrating them. Rebecca's face twisted with fury. So this was all some elaborate plan to embarrass me? You've been playing the long game, pretending to be a failure just so you could humiliate me at my own wedding? The paranoia in her accusation revealed just how deep her narcissism ran. Even faced with clear evidence that she'd been wrong about me, she couldn't conceive of a world where my life wasn't somehow centered around her. Rebecca, I said quietly, not everything is about you. I didn't hide my career to hurt you. I hid it to protect myself from exactly the kind of treatment you demonstrated tonight. Well, congratulations, she spat. You've destroyed my relationship and ruined my wedding, also you could prove how much better you are than me. I haven't destroyed anything. Your behavior tonight destroyed things. Your choice to publicly humiliate someone you assumed couldn't fight back destroyed things. The fact that you've spent years treating me like garbage destroyed things. I just existed. And apparently, my existence in the form you couldn't accept was enough to bring down everything you thought you knew about yourself. Rebecca stared at me with pure hatred. David is talking about calling off the wedding. His family thinks I'm some kind of monster. All because you couldn't just stay in your lane and be the failure we all knew you were. Rebecca, I was never a failure. You just needed me to be one to feel good about yourself. She turned and stormed toward the door, but paused at the threshold to deliver one final blow. Don't think this is over, Elena. You may have won this battle, but you've lost your family forever. When you're sitting alone in this fancy office, remember that you chose your precious career over the people who loved you. The people who loved me, I repeated slowly, wouldn't have needed me to hide my accomplishments to maintain their affection. Rebecca slammed the door behind her, leaving me alone in my chambers with the echoing truth of what our relationship had always been, conditional love based on my willingness to make myself smaller so she could feel bigger. But as I sat there in the quiet of my office, surrounded by the symbols of everything I'd worked to achieve, I realized something important. For the first time in my adult life, I was free. Free from the exhausting work of managing Rebecca's ego. Free from the constant accommodation of people who'd never bothered to really know me. Free to be exactly who I was without apology or diminishment. The cost of that freedom was my family, but as I looked around at the life I'd built, the career I'd earned, the respect I'd commanded, the justice I'd dispensed, I realized it might be a price worth paying. The next morning brought a call that would cement the consequences of Rebecca's behavior in ways she'd never imagined. I was reviewing case files in my chambers when my secretary informed me that David Martinez was requesting a private meeting. Given the previous night's revelations, I was curious about what he wanted to discuss. David arrived at my office looking like he hadn't slept. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and stress. When my secretary showed him in, he stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the formal setting of my judicial chambers with something approaching awe. "Judge Rodriguez," he said formally, then shook his head. "I'm sorry, this is so surreal. Elena, thank you for agreeing to see me. Please, sit down, I said, gesturing to the chairs in front of my desk. And given our family connection, Elena is fine when we're speaking privately. David took a seat but remained tense, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Elena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Last night, when she said those things about you, how long has that been going on? The question hung heavy in the air between us. I could see in his eyes that he already suspected the answer, but he needed to hear it confirmed. Always, I said simply. Since we were children. Rebecca has always needed to be superior to someone, and I was the convenient target. David's face darkened. But your parents? Surely they intervened? My parents enabled it. Rebecca was the golden child, I was the disappointment. They actively participated in the dynamic. Even after you became successful? Even after you became a federal judge? They didn't know I became a federal judge until you told them last night. David stared at me in shock. How is that possible? How do parents not know their daughter is a federal judge? Because they never asked what I actually did for work. They knew I worked at the courthouse, and that was enough for them to dismiss me as unimportant. You know, watching someone realize that the person they're about to marry has been systematically cruel to a family member for years is painful to witness. But sometimes people need to see the truth, even when it destroys everything they thought they knew. What do you think David should do in this situation? Would you call off a wedding over something like this? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that like button if you're invested in seeing how this family drama unfolds. David rubbed his face with his hands, clearly struggling to process what I was telling him. Elena, I need you to understand something. The woman you're describing, that's not the woman I thought I was marrying. Rebecca presented herself as family-oriented, caring, someone who valued loyalty and love above everything else. She does value loyalty, I said carefully. As long as it flows in one direction, toward her. Last night, after you left, my family and I had a long conversation about what we'd witnessed. My mother was horrified. She said watching Rebecca tear you down was like watching someone kick a puppy for sport. The analogy stung because it was accurate. I had been the family punching bag, absorbing Rebecca's need to feel superior while everyone else looked on with approval or indifference. David, I didn't tell you these things to interfere with your relationship. But it does interfere, he interrupted. Elena, I can't marry someone who treats their family the way Rebecca treats you. What happens when we have children? What happens when one of them doesn't meet her standards of success? Will she tear them down the way she's torn you down? The question revealed the depth of his moral crisis. David wasn't just questioning Rebecca's treatment of me, he was questioning what kind of mother and life partner she would be. There's something else, David continued, pulling out his phone. After last night, I started paying attention to things Rebecca says about other people. Look at this text conversation. He showed me a series of messages between him and Rebecca from earlier that morning. Rebecca had been frantically trying to control the narrative about the previous night, but her messages revealed a pattern of dismissiveness toward other people that extended far beyond me. Your sister is being so dramatic about this. Elena always makes everything about herself. Your parents are probably just impressed because they don't understand how common federal judges are. Elena's probably not even that good at her job. She's only 29, how much experience could she have? Each message was another nail in the coffin of David's respect for his fiancé. Rebecca couldn't accept that she'd been wrong, couldn't acknowledge that she'd behaved badly, and couldn't stop diminishing other people to make herself feel better. David, I said gently, you don't need me to tell you what kind of person Rebecca is. You've seen it now. The question is whether you can live with it. He nodded slowly, his decision clearly already made. The wedding is supposed to be next Saturday. I've spent the morning calling vendors, canceling everything. The finality of his statement hit me like a physical blow. David, I never wanted. You didn't cause this, he said firmly. Rebecca's behavior caused this. Her treatment of you, her inability to acknowledge wrongdoing, her continued attempts to blame everyone else for her mistakes, that's what caused this. We sat in silence for a moment, both processing the magnitude of what was happening. A wedding that had been months in the planning, involving hundreds of guests and thousands of dollars, was being called off because Rebecca couldn't treat her own sister with basic human decency. "Can I ask you something?" David said finally. "Why didn't you ever fight back? Why did you let her treat you this way for so long?" It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself since the previous night. "I thought that's what family meant," I admitted. "I thought love meant accommodation, sacrifice, putting other people's needs before your own. I thought if I could just be understanding enough, accommodating enough, eventually they'd see my worth. But they never did. No. They never did. And last night, I realized they never will. Rebecca doesn't want to see my worth, she needs me to be worthless so she can feel valuable." David nodded with the understanding of someone who had just learned the same painful truth. "Elena, I owe you an apology. All those times we've talked, all those family gatherings where I watched Rebecca dismiss your opinions or interrupt you when you were speaking. I should have said something. I should have recognized what was happening. You couldn't have known. I should have known that the way someone treats their family is the most accurate predictor of their character. Rebecca showed me exactly who she was, and I chose not to see it because it was inconvenient." The conversation was interrupted by my secretary's voice over the intercom. "Judge Rodriguez, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Rebecca Rodriguez is here demanding to see you. She's quite agitated." David and I exchanged glances. "Send her in," I said, knowing this confrontation was inevitable. Rebecca burst through the door seconds later, her face streaked with tears and twisted with rage. When she saw David sitting in my office, her expression shifted to one of betrayal and desperation. "David, what are you doing here? Why are you talking to her instead of me?" "I'm talking to Elena because she's the only person involved in this situation who's been honest with me," David replied quietly. "Honest? She's been lying to our entire family for years. Pretending to be some nobody while she was actually successful and accomplished?" David interrupted. "Rebecca, the only person who lied about Elena's career was you. You were so determined to see her as a failure that you never bothered to ask what she actually did for work." Rebecca's face crumpled as she realized that David wasn't going to be her ally in this crisis. "David, please. We can work through this. What happened last night was just a misunderstanding." "It wasn't a misunderstanding," David said, standing up from his chair. "It was you showing me exactly who you are. And I can't marry someone who treats their family with such casual cruelty." Rebecca's face went white. "You can't be serious. You're calling off our wedding because of her?" "I'm calling off our wedding because of you," David corrected. "Because of how you treat people you think can't fight back. Because of how you diminish others to make yourself feel important. Because when confronted with evidence that you were wrong, your first instinct was to blame everyone else instead of taking responsibility." "David, please. Rebecca, it's over. I've already started canceling the vendors. My family will be reaching out to the guests." Rebecca turned to me with pure venom in her eyes. "This is all your fault. You destroyed my life just to prove a point." "I didn't destroy anything," I said calmly. "I simply existed as myself instead of the diminished version you needed me to be. You could have stopped this. You could have told him we were just having a family disagreement." The entitlement in her voice was staggering. Even now, even after everything, she expected me to manage her consequences for her. "Rebecca," I said quietly, "I'm not responsible for managing the fallout from your behavior. You made choices about how to treat me, and David made choices about what kind of person he wants to marry. Those are the consequences of your actions, not mine." She stared at me with hatred so pure it was almost physical. Then she turned and stormed out of my office, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. David and I sat in the aftermath of her exit, the weight of what had just happened settling around us like dust after an explosion. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," I said finally. "I'm sorry I didn't witness it sooner," David replied. "Elena, can I ask you one more thing? What you've achieved, becoming a federal judge, earning the respect of the legal community, was any of that motivated by wanting to prove him wrong?" I considered the question carefully. "Maybe at first," I admitted. "But eventually, I realized that living your life to prove other people wrong is just another form of letting them control you. I achieved what I achieved because I love the law, because I believe in justice, because I wanted to make a difference. The fact that it happened to prove my family wrong about me was just a side effect." David nodded slowly. "That's probably the healthiest perspective you could have." As he gathered his things to leave, he paused at the door. "Elena, I hope you know that none of this changes my respect for you. In fact, knowing what you've overcome to get where you are makes your achievements even more impressive." After he left, I sat alone in my chambers, processing the magnitude of what had just unfolded. In the span of 18 hours, my secret had been exposed, my sister's wedding had been called off, and my family's entire understanding of our dynamic had been shattered. But for the first time in my adult life, I felt genuinely free. The next few days brought a parade of consequences that rippled through my family like aftershocks from an earthquake. The cancelled wedding became the talk of both families' social circles, and the truth about why it had been called off spread like wildfire through Portland's legal community. My parents' reaction was perhaps the most predictable yet still somehow shocking in its selfishness. Instead of grappling with the revelation that they'd been systematically dismissive of their younger daughter's extraordinary achievements, they focused entirely on the social embarrassment of the cancelled wedding. Mom called me 3 times on Monday alone, each conversation following the same pattern: initial attempts at damage control, followed by blame shifting, and ending with emotional manipulation. "Elena, people are asking questions about the wedding," she said during the first call. "What am I supposed to tell them?" "You could try telling them the truth," I suggested. "The truth?" "That our family is falling apart because you couldn't just keep quiet about your job for one more week." The casual reframing of the situation, as if I had somehow caused the crisis by existing authentically, was breathtaking in its audacity. "Mom, the truth is that Rebecca publicly humiliated me for being exactly what she mocked me for not being. The truth is that her fiancé realized he couldn't marry someone capable of that level of cruelty. The truth is that our family dynamic was so toxic that I felt the need to hide my greatest professional achievements to avoid making Rebecca feel bad about herself." "You're being dramatic," Mom replied, falling back on the family's default response to any criticism. "Rebecca was just stressed about the wedding. You know how she gets." "Yes, I do know how she gets. I've been on the receiving end of how she gets for 29 years. The conversation ended with Mom hanging up on me, but she called back an hour later with a different strategy. "Elena, your father and I have been talking, and we think the best thing for everyone would be if you reached out to David. Maybe if you explained that this was all just a family misunderstanding, he might reconsider." The suggestion that I should clean up Rebecca's mess for her was so perfectly in character for my family that I almost laughed. "Mom, David didn't call off the wedding because of a misunderstanding. He called it off because he saw Rebecca's true character and realized he couldn't live with it." "But surely you could talk to him." "I'm not going to help Rebecca avoid the consequences of her own behavior. Not anymore." By Tuesday, the pressure campaign had intensified. Dad called with his own version of emotional manipulation, this one centered around family loyalty and forgiveness. "Elena, I raised you to be better than this," he said with the disappointed tone that had controlled my behavior for decades. "Family means forgiving each other's mistakes and moving forward together." "Dad, what mistake exactly am I supposed to forgive?" "Rebecca's decision to publicly humiliate me? Her refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing? Her continued attempts to blame me for the consequences of her actions? She's your sister. She's hurting. I'm her sister too, and I've been hurting for years. The difference is that no one ever cared about my pain because it was convenient to ignore it." "You're being selfish, Elena." This is bigger than your hurt feelings." The phrase hurt feelings encapsulated everything wrong with my family's perspective. They still couldn't see that this wasn't about momentary emotional pain, this was about a lifetime of systematic devaluation that had culminated in public humiliation. Wednesday brought the most revealing conversation of all. Rebecca called me directly, and for the first time since childhood, her voice carried genuine vulnerability instead of her usual commanding arrogance. "Elena, I need your help," she said without preamble. "With what?" "David won't return my calls. His family won't speak to me. I need you to tell them that you forgive me, that we've worked things out, that the wedding can go back on." Even in crisis, even facing the collapse of everything she'd planned, Rebecca's first instinct was to manage optics rather than address substance. "Rebecca, I can't fix this for you. You're the only one who can. You're the one they respect now. If you tell them I'm not really a bad person." "Are you a bad person?" I interrupted. The question caught her off guard. "What? You're asking me to tell David's family that you're not a bad person. But you haven't apologized for your behavior. You haven't acknowledged that what you did was wrong. You haven't shown any remorse for years of treating me badly. So I'm asking you directly, do you think you're a bad person?" There was a long silence on the line. I could hear Rebecca breathing, clearly struggling with a question that required more self-reflection than she was capable of. "I'm not a bad person," she finally said. I didn't know. About your job, about how important you were. If I had known. If you had known I was a federal judge, you would have treated me differently. But what about when you thought I was just a courthouse clerk? Did that person deserve to be mocked and humiliated?" Another silence, longer this time. "Elena, you're my sister. I love you." "Rebecca, love isn't a feeling you claim to have. It's a choice you make in how you treat someone. And based on how you've chosen to treat me for 29 years, I don't think you know what love actually means. So you're just going to let my entire life fall apart?" "I'm going to let you experience the natural consequences of your choices. Maybe for the first time in your life." The call ended with Rebecca crying, but they weren't tears of remorse, they were tears of frustration that her usual manipulation tactics weren't working. Thursday brought an unexpected visitor to my chambers. Carmen Martinez, David's mother and a retired appellate judge, requested a meeting. When she arrived, she carried herself with the dignity and gravitas I'd come to associate with respected members of the judiciary. "Judge Rodriguez," she said formally, then smiled warmly. "Elena, thank you for seeing me." "Of course. Please, sit down." Carmen settled into the chair across from my desk, her expression thoughtful. "I wanted to speak with you about the situation with David and Rebecca, but not in the way you might expect." I waited for her to continue. "Elena, I've been a judge for over 20 years. I've seen every kind of family dysfunction imaginable come through my courtroom. But what I witnessed at that dinner, the systematic nature of how your family has treated you, it's disturbing in ways that go beyond simple sibling rivalry." "It's just how our family has always functioned," I said quietly. "That's exactly what concerns me. Elena, healthy families celebrate each other's successes. They don't punish achievement with mockery and dismissal. What your family did to you, forcing you to hide your accomplishments to maintain peace, that's a form of emotional abuse." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd never thought of my family's treatment in those terms, but hearing it from another judge, someone with decades of experience recognizing dysfunction, made it impossible to dismiss. "I want you to know," Carmen continued, "that David's decision to call off the wedding wasn't impulsive. We spent hours discussing what he'd witnessed, and we all agreed that Rebecca's behavior revealed character flaws that would make her unsuitable as a life partner. I never wanted to interfere with their relationship." "You didn't interfere. You simply existed authentically, and that authenticity exposed truths that needed to be exposed." Carmen leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Elena, I also want you to know that you have our family's complete support and respect. What you've achieved professionally is remarkable, but more than that, the grace with which you've handled years of mistreatment shows tremendous character." After Carmen left, I found myself thinking about her words, particularly her observation about emotional abuse. I'd spent so many years normalizing my family's treatment that I'd never recognized it for what it was. That evening, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. I called a family therapist and scheduled an appointment for myself. Not to fix my relationships with my family, but to understand how to build healthier boundaries going forward. For the first time in my life, I was putting my own emotional well-being first. And it felt revolutionary. Friday morning brought a development that no one, least of all Rebecca, had anticipated. I was reviewing briefs in my chambers when my secretary informed me that Rebecca was requesting an emergency meeting, this time accompanied by her attorney. The fact that she'd brought legal counsel immediately put me on alert. When they were shown into my office, Rebecca looked haggard and desperate, while her attorney, a nervous-looking man named Gerald Phillips whom I recognized from family court, appeared uncomfortable with whatever he'd been asked to do. "Judge Rodriguez," Phillips began formally, "my client believes there may be grounds for a legal remedy regarding the situation that has developed." I leaned back in my chair, genuinely curious about what kind of legal theory they'd constructed. "What kind of remedy?" Rebecca jumped in before her attorney could respond. "Elena, you used your position as a judge to intimidate David's family. You abused your judicial authority to interfere with my relationship." The accusation was so legally baseless that I had to resist the urge to laugh. "Rebecca, I didn't tell anyone I was a judge. David's father recognized me from his appearance in my courtroom." "But you could have corrected the record," Phillips said weakly. "You could have clarified that there had been some mistake." "Mr. Phillips, are you seriously suggesting that I had a legal obligation to conceal my professional identity to protect your client's feelings?" Phillips shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "There might be grounds for a civil action based on intentional infliction of emotional distress." Now I did laugh. "Mr. Phillips, your client publicly mocked my intelligence and professional competence in front of a room full of people. If anyone has grounds for an emotional distress claim, it would be me." "Elena, please," Rebecca said, abandoning the legal strategy in favor of direct pleading. "I'll do anything. I'll apologize publicly. I'll pay for therapy. I'll admit I was wrong about everything. Just please, help me get David back." The desperation in her voice was real, but it was the desperation of someone who wanted to avoid consequences, not someone who actually understood what they'd done wrong. "Rebecca, even if I wanted to help you, which I don't, I couldn't. David made his decision based on his own assessment of your character. No amount of apologizing to me is going to change what he saw that night." "But you're respected. If you vouched for me." "I'm not going to vouch for someone who spent years treating me terribly and only offered to apologize when faced with consequences." Phillips tried one more legal avenue. "Judge Rodriguez, there might be ethical implications to your involvement in this family matter. Perhaps the State Judicial Ethics Board should review." I cut him off with a look that had silenced far more experienced attorneys. "Mr. Phillips, I'm going to stop you right there. Are you seriously threatening to file an ethics complaint against a sitting federal judge because she existed authentically at a family dinner?" That's not what I meant to imply. Because if you are making that threat, I should inform you that filing a frivolous ethics complaint against a federal judge is itself a violation of professional conduct rules. And suggesting that a judge should conceal their identity to protect someone else's ego would be laughed out of any ethics review. Phillips went pale. "Your Honor, I apologize. That was not my intention. Mr. Phillips, I think this meeting is over. And I suggest you advise your client that attempting to use the legal system to avoid the social consequences of her behavior is not an appropriate use of the courts." After they left, I sat in my chambers reflecting on how thoroughly Rebecca had misunderstood the situation. She still believed this was about my professional status rather than about basic human decency. She thought that if she could somehow legally force me to minimize my achievements or vouch for her character, she could undo the damage of David's recognition of who she really was. But David's decision hadn't been based on my being a federal judge, it had been based on Rebecca's willingness to publicly humiliate someone she believed couldn't fight back. My judicial status had simply made the irony more dramatic. That afternoon brought another unexpected visitor. Miguel Martinez, David's father, arrived at my chambers with a proposal that caught me completely off guard. "Judge Rodriguez, I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I wanted to discuss something with you that's not related to the family situation." "Of course. Please, sit down." Miguel settled into his chair with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. "Elena, I've been following your judicial decisions since that night at dinner, and I'm even more impressed than I was initially. Your work on corporate liability cases has been groundbreaking." "Thank you, but I suspect this isn't just a professional courtesy call." Miguel smiled. "You're right. Elena, I'm part of a committee that's been tasked with recommending candidates for a new appellate court position that's opening up. It's a significant step up from district court, and frankly, you're exactly the kind of innovative legal mind we need at the appellate level." The offer was stunning. Appellate court appointments were rare and prestigious, typically reserved for judges with decades of experience. The fact that I was being considered after less than a year on the district court bench was unprecedented. "Mr. Martinez, I'm honored by the consideration, but don't you think my involvement in your family's situation creates a conflict of interest?" "On the contrary," Miguel replied. "The fact that you've handled this entire situation with such grace and professionalism, despite the personal attacks on your character, demonstrates exactly the kind of judicial temperament we need. You didn't abuse your position, you didn't retaliate inappropriately, and you maintained your dignity throughout. Those are the qualities of an excellent appellate judge." As Miguel outlined the position and the nomination process, I realized that Rebecca's attempt to destroy my credibility had actually enhanced it. Her public humiliation of me, followed by the revelation of my true professional status, had created a narrative that showcased my character and competence in the most compelling way possible. "There is one thing I need to tell you," I said carefully. "Rebecca and her attorney were just here threatening to file ethics complaints if I don't help repair her relationship with David." Miguel's expression darkened. "That's exactly the kind of behavior that convinced us David made the right decision. Elena, don't worry about frivolous ethics complaints. The legal community knows exactly what happened at that dinner, and the consensus is that you handled an impossible situation with remarkable professionalism." After Miguel left, I found myself marveling at the irony. Rebecca's efforts to diminish me had led directly to the greatest professional opportunity of my career. Her public mockery of my pathetic courthouse job had exposed my actual achievements to exactly the right people at exactly the right time. But more than that, the entire situation had forced me to stop hiding my accomplishments and start owning my success. For years, I'd downplayed my achievements to avoid threatening Rebecca's ego. Now, freed from that obligation, I was discovering just how much respect and opportunity had been waiting for me all along. That evening, I called Patricia Martinez, David's sister, to share the news about the appellate court opportunity. "Elena, that's incredible," she said enthusiastically. "You absolutely have to pursue it. The appellate court needs judges who understand both the law and human nature, and you've demonstrated both in spades." "I keep wondering if I should feel guilty about how everything turned out," I admitted. "Guilty? Elena, you survived years of emotional abuse with your integrity intact, achieved extraordinary professional success despite being undermined by your own family, and handled public humiliation with grace and dignity. The only person who should feel guilty is Rebecca, and frankly, I'm not sure she's capable of that level of self-reflection." Patricia's words crystallized something I'd been struggling to understand. This wasn't a story about me destroying Rebecca's life, this was a story about me finally refusing to destroy my own life to protect hers. And for the first time in my adult life, I was choosing myself. 6 months later, I stood in the ceremonial courtroom of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, taking the oath that would make me the youngest appellate court judge in the circuit's history. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was achieving this milestone in a room packed with legal luminaries, while my biological family was notably absent from the ceremony. But the people who were there, the family I'd chosen rather than the one I'd been born into, made the moment more meaningful than any biological connection could have. Carmen and Miguel Martinez sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Patricia had flown in from her university to attend, bringing several of her law students who wanted to witness history. David, now dating a kind-hearted public defender who actually appreciated his thoughtful nature, had become an unexpected friend and supporter. Most importantly, Maria from the catering company was there with her husband, both dressed in their finest clothes and looking absolutely delighted to witness my swearing-in. She'd become more than a client, she'd become a reminder that dignity and respect aren't earned through titles or achievements, but through how we treat each other as human beings. The 6 months following Rebecca's cancelled wedding had been a masterclass in how consequences ripple through lives when people are finally forced to confront reality instead of manufactured narratives. Rebecca herself had spiraled in ways that were both predictable and dramatic. Unable to accept responsibility for the collapse of her relationship, she'd embarked on a campaign to rehabilitate her image that had backfired spectacularly. She'd tried to spin the story as David's family being elitist and unable to accept her down-to-earth values, but too many people knew the truth about what had actually happened at that dinner. Her law practice had suffered significantly. Word travels fast in legal circles, and the story of her public humiliation of her federal judge sister had made her a pariah among many potential clients and colleagues. 3 major clients had quietly terminated their relationships with her firm, citing philosophical differences that everyone understood were really about character concerns. But perhaps most devastatingly for Rebecca, she'd lost the thing she'd always valued most, her status as the family's success story. Our parents, faced with the undeniable reality of my judicial appointment and the social embarrassment of Rebecca's behavior, had been forced to recalibrate their understanding of which daughter was actually the family achievement. Mom's attempts to reach out to me had been exercises in damage control rather than genuine remorse. She'd started with attempts to minimize what had happened. Everyone says things they don't mean when they're stressed. Progressed to rewriting history, we always knew you were special, and finally settled on outright manipulation. Your father's health isn't good, and this family conflict is making it worse. But I'd learned to recognize these patterns for what they were, emotional manipulation designed to restore the status quo rather than address the underlying dysfunction. My sessions with my therapist had given me the tools to maintain boundaries without guilt, and I'd used them consistently. Dad's approach had been different but equally ineffective. He'd tried the authoritarian route, demanding I fix this situation for the good of the family. When that failed, he'd switched to bargaining, offering to pay for family therapy if I would just forgive and forget Rebecca's behavior. Finally, he'd resorted to threats about cutting me out of the family entirely, threats that lost their power once I realized being cut out of a toxic family was actually a blessing rather than a punishment. The most revealing development had been their reaction to my appellate court appointment. Instead of feeling proud of my extraordinary achievement, they'd been resentful that it made Rebecca look even worse by comparison. Mom had actually suggested I turn down the appointment because it would be embarrassing for Rebecca to have a sister with such a high-profile position. The suggestion that I should limit my own success to protect Rebecca's ego was the final confirmation that my family's love had always been conditional on my willingness to make myself smaller. Refusing that demand had felt like the ultimate act of self-liberation. You know, reflecting on this entire journey has me thinking about the difference between the family you're born into and the family you choose. Sometimes the people who share your DNA are the least capable of seeing your worth, while strangers become the ones who celebrate your success. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and self-respect? How do you handle it when the people who should love you unconditionally are the ones tearing you down? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to set boundaries with toxic family members, even when it meant losing relationships you thought were important? What's your take on choosing your own well-being over keeping family peace? If this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe, because sharing these experiences helps all of us feel less alone when we're dealing with difficult family dynamics. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's toxic behavior, even when they're family. The most satisfying aspect of my new life wasn't the professional success, though the appellate court work was intellectually stimulating and meaningful. It was the peace that came from being surrounded by people who valued authenticity over accommodation. David's friendship had evolved into something I'd never experienced before, a relationship with someone who knew both my professional achievements and my personal struggles, and respected both. He'd shared his own story of growing up with demanding parents and learning to set healthy boundaries, and we'd bonded over the challenge of building authentic relationships after years of managing other people's expectations. Carmen Martinez had become an informal mentor, sharing insights about navigating the higher levels of the judiciary while maintaining personal integrity. Our weekly coffee meetings had become a source of wisdom and encouragement that I'd never received from my biological family. But it was my relationship with Maria that had taught me the most about real family values. She'd built her catering business into a thriving enterprise, and every success had been shared with genuine enthusiasm by her entire extended family. Watching her children celebrate their mother's achievements with pure joy had shown me what healthy family dynamics actually looked like. The appellate court work itself had exceeded my expectations. The cases were complex and intellectually challenging, requiring deep analysis of constitutional principles and legal precedents. But more than that, the decisions I wrote would shape law for generations, affecting thousands of lives in ways that district court rulings rarely could. My first major opinion, dealing with digital privacy rights in the age of social media, had been cited by other circuits within weeks of publication. The Wall Street Journal had written a profile of me titled "The Judge Who Gets Technology," and several law schools had requested permission to use my decisions in their constitutional law curricula. None of this would have been possible if I'd continued accommodating my family's need to keep me small. Rebecca's public humiliation had forced me into the light, and that light had revealed opportunities and relationships I'd never imagined possible. The final irony came on my one-year anniversary as an appellate judge. I received a letter forwarded through the court's administrative office, a formal request from Rebecca asking me to officiate her wedding to someone new, a real estate agent she'd been dating for 3 months. The letter was a masterpiece of manipulation, carefully crafted to appear humble while actually being deeply selfish. She claimed to have learned and grown from our family conflict, expressed gratitude for the hard truths I'd forced her to confront, and suggested that having me officiate her wedding would be a beautiful symbol of family healing and forgiveness. But reading between the lines, the real message was clear. Rebecca wanted to rehabilitate her image by associating herself with my success, and she thought officiating her wedding would create the appearance that I'd forgiven her and we'd reconciled. I wrote back a brief, professional response: "While I wish you happiness in your marriage, I must respectfully decline your request. I believe it would be inappropriate for me to officiate given our family history." It was the last communication I've had with any member of my biological family. As I wrap up this story, I want to leave you with something my therapist told me that changed my perspective completely: you can't love someone into treating you well, and you can't accommodate someone into respecting you. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop participating in your own mistreatment. Have you ever had a moment where you realized you were enabling someone's toxic behavior by trying to be understanding and accommodating? What gave you the strength to finally set boundaries? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if you believe that respect and dignity aren't negotiable, no matter who's asking you to compromise them, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about choosing yourself even when it's hard. Don't forget to share this with anyone who might need to hear that it's okay to walk away from relationships that diminish your worth. Thank you for listening to my journey from family scapegoat to federal appellate judge. Remember, the people who truly love you will celebrate your success, not punish you for it. Sometimes losing toxic family members is the best thing that can happen to you, because it creates space for relationships built on genuine love and respect. Until next time, remember that you deserve to be surrounded by people who see your value, not people who need you to be less than you are. Your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it, it exists whether they see it or not.